If I were to tell you that Iran has attacked Ukraine, you'd say, you need some proof. But that's essentially what the Russians are maintaining about the Ukrainians using American weapons to attack Crimean Russians. So Ukrainians did use ATACMS to attack in Crimea, and the Russians are essentially saying that now America's involved, but that's patently absurd. It's as absurd as saying that Iran has attacked Ukraine. Iran has provided Shahed drones, but that's not the same as attacking Ukraine. So here's what's happened. Kyiv has struck the Crimean city with U.S. supplied ATACMS. This is an RT. Killing 4 people and injuring more than 120. So Kyiv's forces used several U.S.-made ATACMS. Most of the missiles were shot down by Russian air defenses, but one, which was also hit, veered off course and was detonated over the city. The missile's warhead explosion in midair led to numerous civilian casualties, the defense ministry said. According to the Russian authorities, at least 4 people, including 2 children, were killed in the incident. More than 120 civilians, including 27 children, were injured. Okay, so I don't want civilians to die. That's not the point. But that's not the same as saying that Ukraine, or the United States rather, is responsible for a T. I can't say T on here. You can read what I'm saying here. But here, clandestine. Clandestine is one of the sources, by the way, that Marjorie Taylor Greene follows. World War III alert. Russian mill declare U.S. responsible for the death of Russian civilians in Crimea. Russians claim that they intercepted the missiles, but fragments of one of them broke off, detonated, and the explosion killed 5 civilians, including 3 children, and injuring 124 more. Russian Mill claimed that such actions are not going to be left unanswered. Regardless of who or what you believe, the reality is that we are closer to nuclear war than we have been since 1962, which is a standard Russian talking point as well. The West, led by the corrupt warmongering Biden regime, parentheses Obama, continue to provoke Putin in the hopes that he will escalate. The deep state, by the way, when you hear the word deep state, or the phrase deep state, it's only talking to folks who are MAGA. Only MAGA tend to use that term, deep state. Other conservatives like me don't tend to talk about it. Liberals don't tend to talk about deep state or uniparty or that sort of thing. The deep state are trying to initiate World War III, but need to make it look like it's Russia's fault. Okay. So that's how it's framed in one place. Now, let's get a little bit deeper into it. Russian sources said the cluster munitions landed on civilians near a beach in this park in northern Sevastopol. Now, if you're in a war zone, it's probably not a good idea to be hanging out in the war zone, like on the beach near where weapons might be fired at. But okay, I'm not blaming the civilians. It's just, this might not be the better part of wisdom. The so-called governor of Sevastopol claiming 4 deaths and 151 injuries. Ukrainian military officials neither confirmed nor denied the strike. The ISW could not independently verify if Ukrainian forces used ATACMS missiles with cluster munitions, but the Russian Defense Ministry blamed it on the U.S. appears to be aimed at discouraging further U.S. security aid to Ukraine. Russian military bloggers criticized the Russian Defense Ministries and Crimea's occupation authorities for failing to prevent the strike and protect civilians. They specifically noted the lack of reinforced shelters near the beach, comparing this to shelters built in Russia's Belgorod Oblast near the Ukrainian border. Footage shows Russian forces have been placing military equipment in civilian areas in Crimea since the full-scale invasion began. So, if civilians are being killed because the military equipment is being put close to civilian population centers, it's not exactly the same picture. Russian authorities have promoted tourism to Crimea during the war while using the peninsula for military staging. Not the smartest move if you're trying to avoid casualties. The military is likely positioning targets near civilian areas to deter Ukrainian strikes, and then they go wild about a Ukrainian strike on a military target. Meanwhile, Russia launched an attack on Odesa using 2 cruise missiles, which actually hit a supermarket warehouse. So this is kind of a comparable situation. Russian T attacked Ukraine with 70 guided aerial bombs today. 70 guided aerial bombs, one day. according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. That's at 2,200 hours last night. Now, they're also reporting about 1,000 combat clashes on the front lines in the past week. Last week, Russian T launched 20 missile strikes using 46 missiles, 334 airstrikes using 498 guided aerial bombs across Ukraine. They carried out more than 25,000 attacks, including 660 using multiple rocket launchers. Okay, so that's what's going on in Ukraine. So if you're feeling bad about what was going on in Crimea, and again, I don't want civilians to be in harm's way, but you got to understand what's going on both sides. Okay, let's look at the numbers today. 1,300 Russians off the battlefield. It is 1 month since we clicked past the 500,000 mark. So in 1 month, another 35,660 Russians are off the battlefield. It's astounding. 12 tanks, 15 armored combat vehicles, 51 artillery, 56 vehicles and fuel tanks, 20 special equipment. And if we look at Andrew Perpetua's list of losses, 94 Russian losses, 33 of which are combat assets, to 30 Ukrainian losses, 7 which are combat assets. It's about 3 to 1. It's pretty remarkable what's been going on the battlefield on the front line. Okay, Budanov. He said Ukraine would do everything possible to minimize Russian successes. However, when asked whether Ukraine would be able to hold the town of Chasiv Yar, Budanov said, "I will refrain from answering." That's not a good sign. The good news is that there will be no Armageddon. The bad news is that the situation is quite difficult. It's going to stay that way for at least a month. It's not going to get any easier, Budanov said. Technology will be important enough in this war that we won't be fighting a war to the last citizen, he predicts. That's good. He also describes himself as a fan of moving the war to Russian territory using long-range drones. "I've advocated this from the first days of the war, openly stating that as long as the war is localized on our territory, it will not touch Russia. That's why from the spring of 2022, when we began to conduct significant operations on Russian territory, and we will go farther, the more resources we have for this, and Russia has begun to feel it." In other words, Budanov said the Russian leader Vladimir Putin can no longer pretend to his people that the war does not affect him. It is not yet critical for Russia at this stage, but it has led to the fact that the average citizen in the European part of the Russian Federation knows and feels exactly that the war continues and has felt some of the explosions themselves. This affects, albeit on a small scale, their morale. Now, what was hit yesterday? One of 4 satellite stations required for the Russian space program went up in smoke. And what are we talking about here? It looks like this. Tonight's ATACMS strikes reportedly took out Russian Space Tracking and Communications Center. Why would that be an issue? Well, here's Anton Gurashenko. Reportedly, this is a video of yesterday's strike on Vitino Space Communication Center in occupied Crimea. It functions as one of the key infrastructure elements for communications and control of satellites used for various purposes, including reconnaissance and monitoring. Vitino supports the operation of satellite surveillance and information gathering systems such as LANA system, which includes the Lotos and Pion NKS satellites. Lotos is engaged in passive radar reconnaissance, and Pion NKS uses active radar for maritime reconnaissance. Moreover, the center in Vitino can be used to control electronic warfare systems such as Tereda 2, Balena MM, which are designed to suppress communication signals from enemy satellites. So it's an important link in their operation. Now, where is Vitino? It's up here just above Sevastopol. Okay. The SBU has detained a mole among border guards who spied for the FSB on the Ukrainian-Belarusian border. The Russians promised him evacuation, a job in the occupation security services. The attacker turned out to be a contract worker recruited by the FSB, the head of a local board detachment. He faces life imprisonment. Now, if we roll back the clock just 1 year ago, this is the British intelligence update, where remember Yevgeny Proghzhin, who led 8,000 Wagner personnel on a march for justice, or coup, or whatever you want to call it. That happened 1 year ago today. They were on the road to Moscow 1 year ago today. If you click here, or at the very end, you'll see the video where I talked about what happened, just some of the aftermath about that, and you can go back down a trip down memory lane to kind of understand what was happening. Okay, on a political note, this week 6 more participants joined the Peace Summit communique, and our team is working to get more signatures. This is aftermath of the Swiss Peace Summit. 6 other countries have signed on now, and that's good, because you don't want to just see that Europe is aligned against Russia and perhaps the rest of the world is not paying attention or not interested, or even worse, in Russia's corner. So the more that sign on, the better. And these were pretty easy things to sign on to. No nukes, return Ukrainian children, those kind of things. I saw this and I thought, wow, this is some propaganda. This is Spetsnaz 007. Of course, this is clearly a Russian position. He starts out by saying, I'm probably the bad Russian as usual, but I'd be fake if I never criticized the Kremlin. Well, what's he criticizing the Kremlin for? I'm sorry if I have to break it to you. There's no such thing as peace with the West. What don't we get? They lied to us in 1991, 2008, 14, and 16. Kyiv should be nothing but ash. How exactly is he disagreeing with Russia? That's precisely Russian talking points, but it's framed as if he's somehow bucking the system, which is kind of weird. Last little bit from the parody site Darth Putin on day 849. This is a couple of days ago. On my 3-day war, I went to North Korea. I signed a military agreement with Kim, and then I threatened South Korea, one of the world's best weapons producers, about arming Ukraine. I remain a master strategist. Okay, that's it, my friends. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.